Okay, now that we've successfully got a modal displaying in our component, what we want to do is make this more functional. And we need to pass in the list of roles that are available, get the list of roles the user's currently in, and be able to check to see if they've checked a checkbox, and then output the list of roles back to our component from the modal. And this takes a little bit of work, so we'll split this into two parts. And what we'll start with is we'll go to our roles modal component first of all and see what we need to do inside here. So what we're going to need, and we're going to use an input. In fact, let's clean up all of these. First of all, we don't need any of those properties anymore. And what we're going to do first of all is we're going to create an input. We're going to receive something from our component. So what we'll do is we'll say input. And what we're going to do is say update selected roles. And what we're going to do is use a new event emitter, and we'll bring this in from Angular Core because we want to emit the roles from this particular component. We'll also need access to our user here so we can get the user info. And what we'll also do is bring in the roles, and this is just going to be a type of any, or a type of any array. And then what we'll do inside this component, we'll add a method to update the roles. And what we're going to do is say list.update selected roles. And we're going to say emit and list.roles. And then we'll turn off the modal and we'll say this bs modal ref dot hide. So that's our roles modal component. And we'll go to the roles modal template and make some adjustments in here. So we'll keep the modal header and we'll keep the title, but we'll change this to edit roles for, and then we'll say user.username. And we'll keep the option to close the modal in here as well. We won't change any of that. But inside the modal body, what we're going to have inside here is a form. So we'll create a form. And what we'll do here is we'll just make this a normal template form. So we'll just call it roles form equals ng form. And our buttons are going to be inside the footer here. So what we'll also do is give this an ID and set this equal to roles form. And inside the form, we'll add a div and give it a class of form-check. And inside this div, we're going to loop over our roles. So what we'll do is say a-ng4 and we'll let role of roles. And then inside this div we create an input. And the input is going to be of type checkbox. And before the closing bracket here, what we want to do is give this its classes and what we want to do if it's checked, etc. So what we'll do is we'll give this a class of form-check-input. And then we'll give it a checked property, and we'll say role.checked. And the roles that we're going to pass to this are going to be objects, and we're going to have a checked property inside the role. Effectively true or false. Is it checked or is it not checked? Then we'll add a value, and we'll say role.name. And then we'll add a change event, so we'll say change. And what we're going to do is just set this to the opposite of whether it's checked. So we'll say role.checked is equal to exclamation mark role.checked. And then what we'll also do is we'll make this disabled, this particular input. So there's going to be a list of checks or a list of checkboxes with each of the different roles with a checkbox next to it. And what we'll do is we'll say it's disabled if, and we'll say role.name is equal to admin, and the user.username is equal to admin. We don't want the admin to prevent them from being the admin, basically. Otherwise, our application would never be able to update another role again, especially if the admin is the only admin. So we'll prevent that behavior. And then we'll add a label and we'll remove the for. And what we'll do is we'll just say role.name. And then in the templates, footer, the modal footer, let's remove the close button name and just say cancel. And let's just copy this button down, and we'll change its class to btn success. And for its click event, we'll just pass in the update roles, and we'll say submit. And this takes care of the role modal component. What we'll take a look at next is, because we're going to need to pass some information into this, we'll take a look at the user management component work we need to do next. Okay, the first thing we need to do here is add a method into our admin service so we can actually update the roles. So let's just head over there first. And then what we'll do is we'll just add a method inside here, and we'll call it update user roles. And this is going to take the username, and it's going to take the roles, which is going to be an array. And then what we're going to do is return this.http.post, and we won't give this a type. We'll just say this.base URL plus admin /edit-roles, exactly the same as what we were using in Postman, and then /, and then we need the username, so we'll add this, and then we say plus, and then we add quotes, and after the username we're going to add a question mark, because we're going to send these up as a query string, exactly the same as what we did in Postman. And then we specify roles, and equals, and then we say plus, and then we say add the roles. And because this is a post request, we're going to need to add an empty object, but I just noticed I've got 2 periods there. And after the roles, then we're just going to need to send up an empty object because this is a post request. And let's just give our username a type of string, and the roles is going to be a string array. So we'll say string and array for that one. And we'll just head back to our roles modal component. And now we need to see how we can pass all of this from our component to our roles modal. And let's go across to our component and take a look. So what we're going to do inside this particular modal is we need to get all of that information that our roles modal needs in order to work with what's going on here. So we'll remove the initial state from this first of all, and instead what we'll do is we'll create a const called config, and we're going to set this to an object. And what we can also do is give this some configuration properties. So for example, I'm going to give it a class of modal dialog-centered. And this will ensure that our modal appears in the center of the browser screen. And then what we'll do is we'll give this some initial state. And what we're going to do in here is we're going to pass the user. And what we're also going to do, and we need to pass in the user into this method. So we'll say user is a type of user. And we'll also go to our components and pass in the user to this method. And let's head back to our user management component. And what we also need to do is pass the roles. But what we're going to need to do for this is create a method, because this is going to need some logic inside it. And we'll remove this initial state and swap this for our config. So this roles, what we need for this is we need to know which roles the user is in, so that we can populate the checkboxes that are already checked. And for the roles that the user is not in, we need to make them available to be shown inside the modal in an unchecked state. So what we'll do is we'll create a method, a private method in here called getRolesArray. And we'll take in our user as a parameter here. And what we'll do is we'll start off with just an empty array. So we'll say const roles equals an empty array. And then what we'll do, we'll get hold of our user roles. So we'll say user roles equals user.roles. And then we'll set the available roles available to be selected. So we'll say available roles. And we'll just give this a type of any array. And we'll set this equal to, and we'll just pass in objects that are going to make up the values that can be selected in our checkbox. So we'll have a name of admin and a value of admin. And then we'll add a comma and just copy this down twice, and we'll have moderator and the value of moderator, and also the member with a value of member. And then what we need to do is loop over these available roles and find out if our user is a member of any of those available roles. If they are, then we're going to check the checkbox basically. So let's go through and loop over our available roles. So we'll say for each, and we'll say role. And we want to check to see if the user role matches this role. So what we'll do is we'll say let is match equals false. And then what we'll do is say for, and then we'll loop over the roles of the user role. So we'll say const user role of user roles. Kind of a loop within a loop is what we're doing here. And what we're going to do is check to see if the role.name is equal to the user role, which is just a string. And then if it is a match, we're going to set is match equal to true. And then we're going to say role.checked is also equal to true. And then we're going to say roles.push, and then we're going to add the role into our roles array, which is all the way up here. And what we'll do, because we're in a loop within a loop, we're going to break out of this. And then below the for loop, what we want to do is check to see if the role is not a match. So the user roles, it's either going to be checked or it's not going to be checked. And we're setting this property to true, and then we're pushing the role into this roles array. And we're still inside our for each loop at this stage underneath this for loop. So what we're going to do is say, add the exclamation mark and say is match. And then what we'll do is we'll say role.checked equals false. And we'll say roles.push and then the role. And underneath this, we can then return the roles. And then what we can do is come back up to our roles, and then we can add a colon and say this.get roles array. And we'll pass our user into this. And then what we need to do is if we go back to our roles modal component, we need to deal with this. Because we're going to get the roles that have been checked from this method back into our component, and we need to deal with what happens when that happens. So what we'll do is we'll head back to our user management component. And we do this inside the bsmodalref.content. And what we're going to do is say update selected roles, and this needs to match the name we've given the input inside our roles modal component. So update selected roles. And then we need to subscribe to this. So we'll say subscribe, and we'll pass in values. And then inside here, what we're going to do is say const roles to update, and we'll set this equal to an object, and we're going to say roles, and then we're going to set this to all of the values that have been checked that we get back from our modal. So we're going to have this inside our values. Everything that's been checked is going to be inside there. So what we'll do is we'll use the spread operator to spread the contents of the values inside here, and then we're going to filter out anything that hasn't been checked. So what we'll do is we'll say el goes to el.checked equals true, and then we're going to map, and we're going to get the elements and the element.name. And then we'll check to make sure that we have something to update. So we'll say if roles to update, and then we're going to go to our admin service, and we're going to say update user roles, and then we're going to say user.username, and then roles to update dot roles, and then we're going to subscribe. And then inside the callback function here, what we're going to do is say user.roles equals, and then we'll use the spread operator again and say roles to update.roles. And with all of this in place, it's a bit verbose, I understand, because we're doing quite a lot of work inside here to get this over to our modal so that something can be done when we select this. But let's take a look and see how we're getting on. And if we go back and let's just refresh our page. And if we click on edit roles, then we see edit roles for Bob. and Bob is a member, and if we click on moderator and we click submit, then we see that Bob has been updated. By the way, if you're seeing anything other than this at the moment in testing, it's 50-50. Sometimes I needed to restart the Angular server, sometimes I just needed to refresh the browser, but it's kind of 50-50 with this BS modal service. So if you do run into problems with this, first troubleshooting step is to restart the Angular server, second is to, or the first is to refresh the browser, and the third is to double check your code and compare it against mine, because it's a bit tricky, this one, to do what we're doing here, but it does actually work. And now Bob is a moderator, and if we refresh, we should find that this has persisted on our server as well. And if we logged in as Bob, then we'd be able to see the photo management component. And I don't want Bob to be a moderator, so Bob is going to lose his position and click submit, and he's back to being a member. So it works both ways. Now we've just about come to the end of this particular section, so let's just check our console, make sure that we're clean, and I'll just edit the roles again and click on moderator and submit. Make sure everything's fine, and I'm going to presume that this is okay. And what we do when everything's okay, we come to the end of a section, then we submit our changes into source control. So that's what we'll do now. We'll head over to VS Code. Let's close all of these down. 37 changes in this section. Wowzers. Okay, so we'll say end of section 16 in this case. And we're going to stage our changes. And then we're going to commit our changes. And then we're going to push them up to GitHub in preparation for what we're going to look at next.